Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this general introduction to families across households. It's the first session that we are running on this topic, so I hope that it tells you something new about the data set. It really excites you to carry out some research using the data that we collect on families across households. Just as a little bit of housekeeping, like I said, it's being recorded, this session. If you do have any questions, please just pop them in the chat. So I'll try and monitor the chat as I go along, but if not, there's also some time at the end where I can go through them. So this webinar today is a companion to one a fortnight ago, which was the Family, Children and Households webinar. So it's really just about expanding about on what information we collect about families that span across different households. And I'm going to talk to you today about what it is that we capture, where you can find this data, and then also how it's expanded over time, because in waves 14 and 15, there were a number of changes which increased the data that we held on these families. So the structure of the session, just going to... So the structure of the session is split into 4 parts today. So first, I'm just going to start with a brief outline of understanding society and that previous seminar that I just mentioned. Then I'm going to talk through what I mean by families across households, what sort of topics that they cover, and also explain understanding society's following rules, because that very much affects the coverage of the data that you'll have access to. And then in the third part, I'm going to talk about where you find families across household data in the questionnaire, and then how that feeds through to the data files that you'll have access to. And then finally, I'm going to talk through some key topic areas, so you can really see about what kind of research questions you might be able to look at with these. And I'm going to talk through in detail some of the changes in rows 14 and 15. Okay, so starting with a brief outline of Understanding Society. So if you're not familiar with Understanding Society, I really strongly recommend that you attend our introduction lectures. They're very comprehensive in terms of the nature of the study, how you would navigate it and have access to the data. So this is very brief overview that I'm going to talk through here. We're a multi-topic study. It's a household study covering a wide range of topics. It's longitudinal, so it's over 30,000 UK households, and it's been running since 2009. The predecessor was the British Household Panel Survey, which is from 1991. So you can join both sets of data together to have a very long longitudinal window. So the Understanding Society part of it has been running, like I said, since 2009. So we've got 15 waves of data currently available. And wave 16 will be available from November 2026. And we collect data about all household members. So everyone over 16 in the household is interviewed directly or invited to be interviewed. And also there's the youth survey for 10 to 15-year-olds. And the data that we get back from the survey is reported across several different files. Some key identifiers that you will need to know about is the PIDP, which is it links people across waves so that you can see longitudinally their data. And also the household identifier, which identifies households within each wave. So here you can find all the different people that belong to one household. And just to mention here that household identifier isn't longitudinal, because household compositions can change over time, but it does contain everyone in the household within each wave. Okay, so if I just recap here what was covered in the previous seminar, the previous webinar, but this slides from this webinar will be sent to all participants, so you have that to reference. So what that really spoke about is the family topics that we have in Understanding Society. So it's very broad even within this subtopic. So we have information on partnership and marital status. So we've got partnership histories as well. Extended family networks. So we have information about grandparents and siblings and parents in certain questions. We have extensive information about children and parenting, so parenting styles, child development, those kinds of questions, and also financial questions about childcare and child maintenance. And finally, we also have the social support network, so how often people socialise with non-family members, and also whether there is a caring obligation. So there's a very wide range of topics within family, children and household data. That's all I'm going to say about that in general, when I now hone in on the subject of today's webinar. So just want to clarify what it is I'm talking about when I'm mention families across households, and then talk you through understanding society's following rules. So I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide where I was talking about the different topics, and so you can see how each of these relationships can span across more than one household. So for example, you can see that someone might be in a partnership, have a relationship with someone who they're not living with, non-co-resident partner. You can see it's quite typical for wider family members to be living in a different household, parents or grandparents, for example. Also, some individuals may have a child, a dependent child living in a household elsewhere, or there might be a child within an understanding society household whose other parent is living in a different household. And then finally, there can be caring obligations across households. You could care for someone somewhere else or be the recipient of care from someone who lives in a different household to yourself. So each of these topics can span across households, and you can see how that might also change over time. They may live together as a family, and then if parents separate, they're now living across more than one household. So these are the sorts of relationships that I have in mind when I'm talking about families across households. By no means is it an extensive list. There may be some that I've missed here, but these are the main ones where we can collect a range of data, which I'm going to be focusing on today. Okay, so I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining the following rules because it's really important in terms of understanding how much data we collect and who we directly interview. It determines what data we have available and whether it's a direct report. So the first thing to understand is that when a sample was first selected, so that's either in wave 1 of Understanding Society in 2009, or in a boost wave where households were selected, so that's wave 6 or 14, and will also be in wave 20. In any of these samples, everyone who's enumerated within the household is an original sample member, and they form part of the core sample. Anyone who moves in with an original sample member in a subsequent wave is considered to be a temporary sample member. And then the only exception to this is if a temporary sample member, a male temporary sample member, has a child with a female original sample member, then their status will change to permanent sample member, and the child will become an original sample member. The implications of these are that an original sample member and a permanent sample member remain eligible for interview as long as they live in the UK. So even if their household changes, they stop living with another original sample member, they are followed and we attempt to directly interview them. Temporary sample members, however, only remain eligible for interview as long as they are living with an original sample member. And the rationale for that is that when they are part of the household, that's important context for the core sample member that we're interested in. When they move out, they're no longer providing that context, so they're not interviewed directly. The exception is because when they have a child together, that context becomes more permanent because they now have a child, an original sample member child, to provide that context for. Now, as you can see, this I said here, it's when it's a male temporary sample member and a female original sample member. So there is a gender difference there. The British Household Panel Survey was gender neutral, so it applied regardless of the gender of the parent. But in Understand Society, from waves 1 to 16, there's this gender rule. It will be changed from wave 17 so that it's gender neutral, so that the child will always take on the status of the the primary parent, and the secondary parent will become a permanent sample member, even if they are female. Okay. So hopefully that's clear. I can't see the chat, so I can't see if there's anything in there, but please just give me an indication if there is any questions there. Okay, so I'm moving on to part 3 now. So I'm going to look at the family across households in the questionnaire, and then talk through how it gets from the questionnaire into the data files. So one useful habit, I think, for users when they're interested in a particular concept is to see where it is in the questionnaire and then follow the logic through to where it will end up in the data file. And I'll try and demonstrate this with a diagram. So first of all, we've got the samples. So like I said, you have a household here. These are original sample members. First of all, you have a household questionnaire. So that's completed. It's just a single questionnaire, which results in a single row in the household response file. Usually it's one person who can complete it. They can complete it jointly, but it's one interview, a combined interview. And then there's individual questionnaires. So every individual over 16 will complete a questionnaire, and they will then appear as separate rows within W INDRES. So this W denotes basically the wave number. So if it's wave 1, it's A underscore. If it's wave 2, it's B underscore, and so on. So this is just denoting the household response file and the individual response file. So this is the diagram where I'm trying to demonstrate how the individual questionnaire is structured, because that's what I'm going to focus on today. That's where the main family across households content lies. So the individual questionnaire is comprised of several different modules. And so I've got here just modules which are related to family across households as a topic. It's by no means exhaustive. It's just an illustration of those kinds of modules. So there's lots of different modules within the individual questionnaire. And you can see that how often they're asked or how they are asked is very dependent. It differs. And that's quite important for families across household, because often that's triggered by a change in relationship status or a certain life event like becoming pregnant or having a baby. So I will talk through these each one by one, but I just wanted you to have an idea of the structure. So you've got your questionnaire here, you have your individual modules, and then how that then flows in from that. So zooming in first on the first one that we had in that list is the fertility history module. This is asked of new entrants at baseline. So it was asked in wave 1 about any biological, adopted or stepchildren that you have, and this includes resident and non-resident children. And it was also asked in wave 6 and wave 14, which were the boost waves. And the exception to this is it was also asked of all participants in wave 15, and that was to populate a child summary module, which created its own baseline of family relationship, which fed in the background to other questions. So you can find the answers to these fertility history questions in INDRES, but also child loop files in long format in each of these waves. So if you're interested in these types of questions about children that participants have ever had, these are the two places, or the various files to look depending on the relationship you're interested in. So moving on then to the next 3 that I've got in the map here, we're looking at questions which are asked annually and are triggered by a certain event. So for example, we have in annual event history, which became annual fertility history, whether the individual had a newborn since their last interview, that's resident or non-resident. We looked at whether the individual was currently pregnant, and they ask a set of questions about that. And then there's also a module on non-co-resident relationships. So if they report having a partner living elsewhere, then there's a set of questions asked on that. So they're asked every year, but only triggered if the certain event you answer yes to a certain one of these events. And again, this data is in the INDRESP file, and then for all of them, but then there's also a newborn file, which is populated from the annual event history, annual fertility history modules. Okay, and then finally, there are rotating modules. So these are not asked every wave, they're asked on a rotation pattern. So these three that I'm talking about here were asked every odd wave, and then they moved to a 3-year rotation. The family networks module asks about not any non-resident family member. So it includes grandparents and children over 16, as well as children under 16 living elsewhere. The non-resident children module asks, which was in wave 15 only, is asking about children under 16 living elsewhere. And the child maintenance module is asking about a dependent child and the household's parent who is living elsewhere. And again, these flow into the INDRESP file for each of them, but there's also a looped file per child for the non-resident children and a loop file per child for the parent living elsewhere in Chennai. And I just wanted to touch upon as well the derived files that we have available. So we have ego alt, which is within each wave, it has the relationship of all the different household members. And then we have cross-wave files like the family matrix, which is XHHREL, and that tells relationships between everyone in the sample over time. So you can look at parents, you can look at grandparents and siblings and connect them together by their personal identifier and carry out research in that way. We have X-wave DAT, which has, again, cross-wave indicators, and particularly useful for this topic area is we have indicators showing whether children and parents have always lived together whilst they've been part of the study or ever lived together as part of the study. So that's sort of in an analysis ready format for you if you're interested in that topic area. And then finally, we have the Peach file, X-wave Peach, which is cross-wave data on pregnancies, newborn and child development and parenting styles. So that pulls together all information across the study on these topics and puts them into one file. That is part of a separate download. It's not the general data release, the 6614 that you would have downloaded. So just to flag that it's accessed in a different way. Okay, so I'm going to now talk through the key topic areas for families across households, and then really sort of talk you through where the changes were in waves 14 and 15. What I'm going to do is keep the module map at the top, which we just spoke through, so you can kind of see how the different modules in the questionnaire relate to the topic area I'm now going to be discussing. So hopefully it's a bit clearer because I appreciate it's quite complicated. So my first example is thinking about the relationship status between a parent in a household with a child and the other parent is living elsewhere. And I'm going to talk you through what information we collect and how that has changed over time. So between waves 1 to 13, there was no direct question which asked about the relationship status of this parent living with the child with the parent elsewhere. It could only really be inferred by the presence of a parent in the household or not. So in wave 14, there was introduced a new question which directly asked about this. So it asked the resident parent what their relationship status is. So for all children where the other parent is not in the household, and also for newborns where newborn is reported and the other parent is not in the household. This was adapted slightly in wave 15 to split it into 2 time points so that you can now have a retrospective question. So it asked what was the relationship status with the child's other parent at the time the child was born, and then what is the current relationship status. So this introduces some questions which might be relevant if you're interested in family formation patterns, or family diversity, and you can really sort of get a bit more information there rather than regarding an absent parent as necessarily a separation or that they're not present. It could be that they're in an ongoing relationship. So that's quite useful addition there. Secondly, looking at pregnancy, a similar sort of thing. So between ways 1 to 13, we have these questions about, have you had a pregnancy since the last interview? And then you could look using this pregnancy outcome variable to see whether the person said that they are currently pregnant as opposed to haven't had a child. But there was concern that pregnancies weren't being reported. So there were changes in way 14 to sort of look at currently pregnant in its own right. But also similarly to the example I just mentioned, the relationship status between the child's other parent, the unborn child's other parent, again, can only be inferred by the presence or absence in the household grid. So what changed in way 14 is that the option of current pregnancy was excluded from this has had a pregnancy variable, and the outcome of currently pregnant was removed from these pregnancy variables, and a new question was introduced, which came earlier in the questionnaire and asked, are you currently pregnant? So it's a direct question, and the hope is that it would identify more pregnancies. At the same time as this change, we also introduced a direct question about the relationship status with the child's unborn parent if there's no spouse or partner in the household. So again, it can say that they're currently in a relationship but living apart. They could be currently married or living apart, or never in a relationship. So it has those options there. So we've got that context right from the point of pregnancy. Similarly, there was a question introduced which asked whether an individual's spouse or partner in the household is pregnant. Again, because this question wasn't asked previously, and it just adds more information as to whether there is an expectant father in the household, for example. Well, we wouldn't have known that. We would only have got it directly from the pregnant person. So in way 15, the changes in way 14 were just consolidated into one module and distinct variables. The same questions were asked about, are you currently pregnant? What's your relationship with the unborn child's other parent? And is your spouse or partner pregnant? But it was consolidated into modules and a dedicated current pregnancies modules as of way 15. Okay, so this slide I've included just as an illustration for the value of some of these changes. So you can see here, this is the way 15 data, individuals who reported a current pregnancy. And you can see the bulk, 63% are living with their spouse and 20% are living with their partner. But what's interesting is here, we've got 12% of currently pregnant individuals said they're currently in a relationship or married, but not living with the other parent. So it's a significant minority, and otherwise we would have perhaps regarded this individual as a lone parent, or perhaps just that there isn't another parent because they don't co-reside. So it's important context, and this figure is in keeping with other findings in the literature that this is around this level in Britain of people who don't live together during pregnancy or even at the point of birth. So interesting information coming out there. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to non-co-resident relationships. So this is when an individual was in a relationship with someone living elsewhere. We wouldn't be interviewing this person directly who's living elsewhere. They're not part of a sample. So it's only if they were to move in together they would be interviewed. But we do ask the core sample member some information about this relationship because it's important characteristic and context for that individual. So this question is the one that's asked: do you have a steady relationship with someone you're not living with who you think of as your partner? It's asked every way. It's in the self-completion module, so individuals have to agree to do the self-completion module to then answer this question. And it's on every wave from wave 3, and it's in this INDRESP file. Quite a few papers have been published using this particular data set, so it's quite useful. It's quite a wealth of information there, and I've just put a screenshot here of the website where you can find out more about the about how to navigate through the website and find these variables. So I was going to just click through to show you. I don't know whether this is going to share. Just see. It's going to load. Could somebody give me a thumbs up or something if you can see my web page?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Can we see it now?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you. So I was just going to show you here how you could find variables. So you can just use the search box, and for the variable we were looking at is NCRR1, and you can search for it here. So on the main stage, you can click on it here. You can see the content of the question, the wave that it was last asked in, the universe that it was asked of, and also you can get frequencies. So you can see here that just under 8% reported being in a non-co-resident relationship in wave 15, and you can scroll through to see all the waves it was asked in, and look very quickly can get an understanding of frequencies over time. That you can see that again it's just under 8% in wave 14, and you can go through there. So it's a really useful tool that you have there to navigate on the website. And I will just flag as well that you can use this toggle at the top to save particular variables, and they go into your right hand column. And you can see I've got a number of variables which are all from this same module. And I believe you can export syntax. A bit further down on this page, you can export syntax to download these particular variables when you download the data set. Okay, so I'm just going to flip back. So yes, so we also ask about contact frequency, how often they see each other, and distance between partners, whether there's any expectations to live together or marry, and basic partner characteristics. So like I said, there have been quite a few papers published on this data. There are a lot of research questions that can be done with this existing data. And what we really wanted to do is build upon this to allow perhaps some more longitudinal, potentially some more longitudinal research and some more detailed research about how it operates in practice. So in wave 14, we introduced some new questions which asked whether the individual you were in a living apart together relationship with in the previous wave is the same in this interview. We also ask about whether they have ever lived together, and a significant minority of individuals have previously lived together and then begin living apart. And then we also ask whether they have ever had a child together or are expecting a child. In wave 15, this was expanded even further. So we adapted some of the existing questions. So there was the expectation, the intention to live together had only had that as an option. So what we did is we broadened that question out to just see about expectations within the next 3 years. So that could be living together, that could be no longer together, living further apart, or getting married. So it's expanded, but it's still harmonizable with previous waves. And we also adapted the decision to live apart question to look at broader reasons for living apart. Again, it's harmonizable looking backwards, but it just keeps it a bit broader and open to different reasons. Then some new questions were also introduced. So we asked if they said that they have previously lived together, as was introduced in Wave 14. We then asked the month and year that they did live together in Wave 15. So this has the potential to be linked up with interview files from previous waves. We ask about how they organise finances, overnight stays and remote contact, any advantages or disadvantages of living apart, and satisfaction with the relationship and living apart. So we have a little bit more information here about how these operate in practice. And so it allows for a bit more substantive research in these questions. Okay, so the fourth example is children under 16 living elsewhere. So there's this scenario where our sample member lives in an understanding society household, and their child lives elsewhere with another parent or with somebody else. This was asked in the family networks module originally, and then between waves 1 and 14, and then from wave 15, a dedicated non-resident children module was introduced, which built out this module in more detail. The data is available every other wave. So between waves 1 to 15, it was every odd wave, and then every 3 waves thereafter. Okay, so looking first at what was collected between waves 1 and 13. So the family networks module was a broader module. It wasn't just about children under 16. It was part of a living relatives question. So the individual was asked whether they have any living relatives outside of the household. And this could be parents, mother, father, but also adult children and children under 16. And it was asked in a general sense, so not on an individual level. And if the respondent said they do have a family member not living with them, they were then asked a series of questions about how often they saw them and the types of help that were given and received, and whether there's any financial aid or given, or the payment of child support if relevant. In wave 14, relevant to children under 16, because that was a boost wave, there was a trial approach to try to identify children living under 16 living elsewhere, both through this living relatives question, but also through fertility history type questions. So those questions I talked about before, where it's sort of, do you have any biological, adopted or stepchildren living elsewhere? And this was based on a previous innovation panel experiment, which saw that increased the sample and increased the reporting of children living elsewhere. So just to flag that wave 14 has this trial approach, and there is a non-resident ID module which appears in that wave only. But because it's a trial module, it's out of the standard rotation. I just recommend caution when using this wave for substantive research, because it changed, and it's not as extensive as the wave 13 and wave 15 versions of this module. Okay, so wave 15, this is the one to use if you want to look at more substantively at this. So what the main change here is that all participants were asked these fertility history questions, which populated the child summary modules. So if you remember, I said it for the fertility history module, all participants, new and existing, were asked this. And if they had a question under a child under 16 living elsewhere, then they flowed into this module about children living elsewhere, non-resident children. And then the nature of the questions were improved. So we then asked these questions looped per every child about the nature of the relationship, so whether they're biological, step, or adopted, who the child lives with. Like I say, this could be grandparents or wider family members or the other parent. And then we ask questions about their living arrangements, whether they split time between households, the contact frequency, payment of child support. And then we also asked about the respondent's relationship with that other parent, and whether they, if they are separated, if they used any support services. So inbuilt to this is the idea that parents can be living apart and not be separated. They could be in an ongoing relationship. So it has that option there as well. Okay, so this is the this final example is the other scenario. So this is where the sample member has a child living in their household, either under 16 or 16 to 19 in full-time education, and the other parent is living elsewhere. This information is collected in the child maintenance module, which is in INDRESP and this Germain file. And this was asked every other way from wave 3 to wave 15, and then on a 3-year rotation pattern from wave 15. So the key thing to note about the child maintenance module is it's not limited to financial questions. It does also, it's broader, and it does include questions that are more about the relationship between the child and the parent as well. So there are financial questions about whether they have any formal or informal arrangements for the payment of child maintenance, whether they receive it, whether they receive maintenance and the timeliness of this and the amounts, and also whether they receive payment in kind or payment for specific items, as well as just cash payments. But there are non-financial questions. So it asks about the characteristics of that parent elsewhere, their age, their marital status, employment status, whether they have other children. It also asks about contact frequency, how often they see the child, and involvement in important decision making, which is a good proxy for co-parenting. So whether they share decision making, whether it's mainly the parent that the child resides with or the other parent, those kind of questions. Okay. So in wave 15, there were some amendments to existing variables to try to make it more harmonized with the previous module, which was where the child is living elsewhere. So the contact frequency categories were harmonized to make them more comparable. And then just in general, the terminology was adapted to acknowledge that parents living apart may not be separated. They may be in an ongoing relationship, may have never lived together. There are also some new modules introduced in wave 15. So this is the sex of the parent living elsewhere, the distance between them, whether there's the presence of a shared care arrangement, and the relationship status with that other parent, and if they are separated, whether they used any support services. So you can see how it's very similar to the previous module I was talking about. Okay, so I was just going to try and demonstrate here the value of having these sort of two different perspectives. So in this non-resident child module, you have the perspective of the parent living elsewhere, and then in the child maintenance, you have the perspective of the parent with care. But they're asked similar questions. So it may be in our sample that we have both halves of the couple. So you can look at their answers for those. It may be that we only have one half, but it's a really useful insight, particularly for understanding society. We're quite unique in that respect, that we capture the perspective of the parent living elsewhere. Often it's reports, and we do know from the literature that there can be disagreement here, between, for example, the frequency of contact from the perspective of the resident parent as opposed to the non-resident parent. So it invites quite some interesting research here from that perspective. Okay, and just was going to go into a little bit more detail here about what I mentioned previously, that we now have these indicators in the X-wave DAT file, which can tell you during the period of the study, has the child always lived with both parents? Have they ever lived with both parents? And if it's changed from 2 to 1, living with both parents, to one parent, when that wave was. So this is a good way to sort of quickly identify those parents, those households where separation may have happened, and very useful in that respect. It's the main caveat here, just to realise that this is only if the separation occurred whilst they were part of the study. If they separated prior to the study, that wouldn't be picked up here in these indicators. Okay. And then I'm just going to talk briefly about the some future data, which is part of the Significant Other survey. So this was a survey which ran alongside the Wave 15 survey. So we have these samples here where we have, for example, a couple who have a partner living elsewhere. So this is the non-co-resident relationship, or a respondent with a dependent child with a parent living elsewhere, or the respondent and the child lives with a parent elsewhere. In each of these scenarios, we asked our Wave 15 participants whether they would be happy sharing the contact details of that significant other, so that partner or that co-parent, or if they would pass on an invitation to take part in our Significant Other survey. So if they agreed and we got their contact details and we successfully contacted them, they would then complete a survey which mirrored a lot of the questions asked of our main sample. So this is potentially very useful research in terms of matched pair analysis. We can look at the reports from both sides, both halves of couples. As you can see from what I've said previously, there's some really detailed, rich questions asked here. So the potential for lots of interesting research questions. The data will be released in 2027. So obviously some of these groups are very hard to reach, particularly the parents living apart groups. So the sample size for the parents living apart is quite modest. So just to bear that in mind, but particularly for the couples living apart, we got a relatively good response rate. So it's definitely something to look out for if this is the area of research you're interested in. Okay, so I'm just going to do a closing summary, really. Just reiterating that the Families Across Household data really looks at family beyond the household. And you can see there's several examples I spoke through where if you were just looking at household composition, you would miss important relationships and important context. The coverage also it's very dependent on the following rules and sample status, so it's important to understand that and in terms of looking for your data. The key files to use are INDRES and then these child loop files. And then the crosswave files can also be a very useful starting point or something to build into your research later. And particularly to just note that Waves 14 and 15 added some very important detail for non-resident partners and parents living elsewhere and children living elsewhere. So I'm just going to put this final slide up, which is the just where you can find some more information, particularly about Wave 15 and how it changed. There's also the user support forum where you can ask questions or email. So and they're very good at getting back to you if you have any specific questions. But if you do have any for me today, do just let me know. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found it useful.